He lived 42 years alone in the desert, the macabre story of Mason Evans. Real quick before we get into it, I'm curious. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Nevada Territory, December 1847. The morning Mason Evans kissed his wife goodbye would turn out to be the final time he ever saw her smile. Sarah stood in the doorway of their timber cabin, their daughter Emma clinging to her skirts, both of them framed by the pale winter sun that barely managed to warm the frozen ground of their small homestead near what would later become Virginia City. "You'll be back before nightfall?" Sarah asked, her breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The Warren was doing little against the sharp wind, sweeping down from the Sierra Nevada. Before sundown, Mason promised, adjusting the rifle sling across his shoulder. At 32, he was lean and weathered from years of prospecting. His hands calloused from working claims that never quite delivered the fortunes he dreamed of. Just need to check the trap lines up near Prospect Ridge. Should have enough pelts to trade for supplies in town tomorrow. Emma, barely 5 years old, ran to him with arms outstretched. Mason scooped her up, feeling the weight of her small body against his chest. Her dark hair, so like her mother's, stuck out from under a knitted cap. "Bring me something pretty, Papa," she asked, her brown eyes wide with hope. "I'll see what I can find, little bird," he said, setting her down and ruffling her hair. Maybe a nice pine cone or a smooth stone from the creek. He didn't know those would be his final words to his daughter. The December sky stretched pale and cloudless above, as Mason made his way through the sparse pine forest, dotting the high desert terrain. The landscape here was harsh and unforgiving, a transition zone where the Sierra Nevada began giving way to the vast expanses of sagebrush desert to the east. Snow clung to the shadowed valleys, but the exposed ridges showed only bare rock and scrub. Mason's trap line ran for nearly 6 miles, following an old animal trail through the roughest country. He moved methodically from trap to trap, finding 2 decent fox pelts and 1 scraggly coyote. Not a great haul, but enough to make the day worthwhile. His mind wandered as he worked, thinking about Sarah's request to move closer to town, somewhere less isolated. "It's too lonely out here, Mason," she'd said just last week. "Emma needs other children to play with, and I need to see other faces besides yours and hers. No offense meant." He'd taken no offense. The isolation wore on him too, though he'd never admit it. Pride kept him tied to this patch of land, this dream of striking it rich in the Nevada silver fields. Every prospector around Virginia City was convinced the next big vein was just one more dig away. The sun was well past its peak when Mason noticed the column of smoke. At first he thought it was just another prospector's campfire, but as he climbed higher up the ridge, the volume of smoke became clear, thick, black, and far too much for a simple cooking fire. His heart began to pound. The direction was wrong, too close to home. Mason started running, the trap line forgotten. He crashed through the brush, his boots slipping on loose shale as he scrambled down the far side of Prospect Ridge. His lungs burned in the thin, cold air. The rifle banged against his back with each stride. Please, God, let it be the Johnson place. Let it be anyone but us. But God wasn't listening that day. He smelled it before he saw it, the acrid stench of burning wood mixed with something else, something that made his stomach turn. When he finally broke through the tree line above his homestead, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The cabin was an inferno. Flames roared through what remained of the roof, consuming everything he and Sarah had built over 3 hard years. The small barn where they kept their 2 mules was also ablaze. But it was the bodies in the yard that stopped his heart. Mason stumbled down the slope, a sound coming from his throat that he didn't recognize as his own voice. Sarah lay face down near the well, her dress dark with blood. Emma was crumpled a few feet away, so small and still that she looked like a discarded doll. He fell to his knees beside his wife, turning her over with trembling hands. 3 bullet wounds, chest, shoulder, abdomen. Her eyes were open but seeing nothing. The blood had already begun to freeze in the cold afternoon air. "Sarah," he whispered, pulling her against him. "Sarah, please, please, no." The world contracted to that single moment, the weight of her body, the smell of smoke and blood, the terrible absence of breath. He held her until his arms went numb, rocking back and forth, unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Eventually his gaze drifted to Emma. He couldn't bring himself to move toward her, not yet. If he didn't touch her, didn't confirm it, maybe there was still hope. Maybe she was just unconscious. Maybe a sound made him look up. 3 men on horseback were watching him from the ridge above, silhouetted against the dying light. Even at a distance, Mason could see the rifles across their saddles. One of them, a tall man in a dark coat, raised a hand in a mock salute. Then they turned and rode east, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Mason sat in the frozen mud of his yard, holding his dead wife, staring at the place where the riders had been. Something fundamental broke inside him in that moment. Not dramatically, like a bone snapping, but quietly, like a rope slowly fraying until only a single thread remains. By the time full darkness fell, even that thread had given way. The next morning, a neighbor named Thomas Brennan rode up to investigate the smoke still rising from the ruins. He found Mason sitting exactly where he'd been the night before, covered in frost, his wife's body cradled in his arms. Emma lay nearby, a blanket that Mason had retrieved from the smoldering cabin, now covering her small form. "Jesus Christ, Mason," Brennan breathed, dismounting quickly. "What happened here?" Mason's eyes were open, but they didn't seem to register Brennan's presence. His lips were blue from exposure. "Mason, can you hear me?" Brennan grabbed his shoulder and shook him. "Who did this?" Finally, slowly, Mason's head turned. When he spoke, his voice was a ruined rasp. 3 men rode east. "Did you recognize them?" "No." "We need to get the marshal, get a posse together. They can't have gotten far." "They're gone," Mason said flatly. He looked down at Sarah's face, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with a gentleness that seemed obscene against the violence of her death. "Everything's gone." Brennan helped him bury them that afternoon, Sarah and Emma together in a single grave on the hillside overlooking what had been their home. A handful of other neighbors came, awkward with grief and anger. They spoke words Mason didn't hear, offered help he didn't acknowledge. The marshal came from Virginia City 2 days later. A tired man named Hicks, who spent half an hour examining the scene and asking questions. 3 riders heading east into the desert, no description beyond that. Could have been claim jumpers. Could have been road agents. Could have been anyone in a territory where violence was as common as sagebrush. "We'll do what we can," Marshal Hicks said without conviction, "but you know how it is out here, Evans. By now they could be in California or Arizona territory. Hell, they could be in Mexico." Mason said nothing. He stood at the grave, a shovel still in his hands, and stared out at the eastern horizon where the desert stretched away forever. "You got family somewhere?" Hicks asked. "Somewhere you can go?" "No." "Friends maybe back east?" "No." The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Evans, I know this is. I can't imagine what you're going through, but you can't stay here. There's nothing left. Come into town. We'll find you a place, help you get back on your feet." "I'm not going to town," Mason said quietly. "Then where?" "I'm not going anywhere." Something in his tone made the marshal take a step back. Mason's eyes were fixed on the eastern desert, and there was a quality to his gaze that Hicks would later describe as already gone. "It was people who did this," Mason continued, his voice eerily calm. "People who took everything. People who kill and burn and destroy. I'm done with people, Marshal. I'm done with all of it." "Now, Evans, you're in shock. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking clearer than I ever have." Mason finally turned to look at him, and Hicks was disturbed to see no tears, no rage, just an emptiness that seemed to go down forever. "You go back to your town, do whatever it is you do. I'll be fine. Evans, get off my land." The marshal tried for another few minutes, but Mason had stopped responding. Eventually, Hicks mounted his horse and rode back toward Virginia City, telling himself he'd send someone to check on the man in a few days, knowing even as he thought it that he probably wouldn't. For 3 days, Mason stayed at the grave. He didn't eat, barely drank. At night, the December cold bit deep into his bones, but he didn't build a fire. He sat with his back against the rough wooden cross he'd fashioned, and he thought about the 3 riders. He thought about riding after them, tracking them down, making them pay. But then what? Kill them? It wouldn't bring Sarah and Emma back. Turn them over to authorities? There were barely any authorities worth the name in Nevada territory in 1847. Justice was a word people used to make themselves feel civilized, but out here there was no real civilization. Just people pretending, and people had taken everything from him. On the 4th morning, as a weak sun rose over the desert, Mason stood up. His legs were stiff, his body weak from exposure and starvation, but his mind was clear, perfectly, terribly clear. He walked down to the burned ruins of his cabin and sorted through the wreckage. Most everything was destroyed, but he salvaged what he could. A cast iron pot miraculously intact, a knife, a few tools. His rifle had survived, along with the ammunition he'd been carrying. From the remains of the barn, he found some rope and a canvas tarp that had only partially burned. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. He didn't pack food, didn't take water beyond a single canteen. He took one last look at the grave on the hillside, fixing the image in his mind not as a place of memory, but as a marker of the moment his old life ended. Then Mason Evans turned his face to the east, toward the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, and walked away from humanity. He didn't look back. The few neighbors who came to check on him in the following weeks found only an abandoned claim, a burned homestead, and a grave that the winter winds were already beginning to erase. Some speculated he'd killed himself somewhere in the desert. Others thought he might have gone after the killers and met a bad end. No one guessed the truth, that Mason Evans had simply decided to stop being part of the human world. That he had chosen the absolute isolation of the desert over any connection to the species that had destroyed his life. And no one could have imagined that this choice would sustain him for the next 42 years. Mojave Desert, January 1848. The desert didn't care about Mason Evans's grief. It didn't care about anything at all. For the first 3 days of walking, he followed the ancient trails east, paths worn by native tribes, later used by trappers and traders moving between Nevada and California. The landscape transformed gradually from the high desert scrubland around Virginia City into something more hostile. Vast alkaline flats that crunched beneath his boots, expanses of sand interrupted by jutting formations of red and brown rock, and always the emptiness stretching to every horizon. Mason walked without purpose, without destination. He simply moved away from Virginia City, away from other homesteads, away from wagon trails and campfire smoke, away from the sound of human voices. The January cold was severe at night, dropping well below freezing once the sun disappeared. Mason would find shelter in rock formations when he could, wrapping himself in the partially burned canvas top and shivering until dawn. He didn't build fires. Fire meant light, and light might draw attention. He wanted no attention, no company, no connection to anything that breathed and spoke. He ate nothing for those first 3 days, drank sparingly from his canteen, rationing the water even though he knew he'd have to find more soon. Part of him wondered if he was simply walking into the desert to die, a slower, cleaner death than putting his rifle in his mouth. But whenever that thought came, he pushed it away. This wasn't about dying. This was about something else entirely, though he couldn't yet name it. On the 4th day, his body made the decision his mind had been avoiding. He collapsed near a dry wash, his legs simply giving out beneath him. He lay on his back, staring up at the pale winter sky, and felt the weakness spreading through his limbs. You have to eat. Some practical part of his brain insisted. You have to survive. But why? What was there to survive for? The answer came not in words but in a memory. Sarah's voice, frustrated with him after he'd spent 3 days drinking in a Virginia City saloon following a failed claim. Don't you dare give up, Mason Evans. Don't you dare waste yourself like that. You're stronger than you think. He closed his eyes. The memory hurt worse than hunger, but it moved him. Mason forced himself to sit up. His hands trembled as he checked his rifle. Still functional, though he'd need to clean it soon. He scanned the landscape, looking for any sign of game. The desert seemed empty, but he knew better. Life existed here. You just had to know how to find it. It took him 2 hours of searching, moving slowly to conserve energy, before he spotted the jackrabbit. It sat motionless near a creosote bush, relying on stillness to hide. Mason's hands were unsteady as he raised the rifle, his vision swimming slightly from dehydration and hunger. The shot echoed across the empty landscape like thunder. The rabbit dropped. Mason stumbled over to it, picked it up by its long ears. It was scraggly, thin from the winter, but it was food. He'd need to make a fire now. No way around it. The thought of attracting attention still disturbed him, but survival won out. He built a small fire in the dry wash using dead brush and the few pieces of wood he could find. The smoke was minimal. The wood was so dry it burned almost clean. Mason skinned and gutted the rabbit with his knife, working with the automatic motions of a man who'd lived rough for years. He skewered the meat on a green stick and held it over the flames. The smell of cooking meat made his stomach clench painfully. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. When the rabbit was barely cooked through, he tore into it, burning his fingers and mouth, not caring. It was tough and gamey, but it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Afterward, sitting by the dying fire, Mason felt something shift inside him, a recognition, perhaps. If he was going to do this, really do this, live out here alone, he'd need to think differently. Not as a prospector passing through, but as something else, something adapted to this place. The next weeks became a study in survival and transformation. Mason moved deeper into the desert, instinctively seeking the most remote areas. He found an ancient landscape of canyons and mesas painted in layers of red, orange, and purple stone. In one narrow canyon, he discovered a series of caves carved into the cliff face, not natural formations, but abandoned dwellings created by indigenous people, perhaps centuries before. He chose a cave about 20 feet up the canyon wall, accessible by a steep, crumbling path. It was small, maybe 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, but it provided shelter from the elements and was hidden from below. You'd have to know it was there to find it. This became his first real home. Mason spent days making it habitable. He carried flat stones up the path and built a small wall across the cave entrance to block wind. He fashioned a crude fire pit near the opening, positioning it so smoke would dissipate against the canyon wall and be less visible from a distance. He used rope to create a simple storage system, hanging his few possessions from stone protrusions in the cave wall. Water was his primary concern. The canyon had no permanent source, but he discovered that water occasionally flowed through after winter storms, collecting in pockets and depressions in the rock. He positioned his cast iron pot to catch rainwater and used his canteen to store extra. He learned to read the sky, to recognize the clouds that meant precipitation was coming. Food came harder. The desert in winter was sparse, but not barren. He trapped more jackrabbits, learning to set snares near their trails. He found a den of pack rats and managed to catch 2 before the others abandoned the area. He learned which plants were edible Mormon tea, mesquite beans from the previous season, the inner bark of certain shrubs. He lost weight rapidly. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His face became gaunt, his eyes hollow. But he survived. By March, when the desert began to warm and occasional spring rains greened the landscape temporarily, Mason had established a routine. He woke with the sun, spent the morning checking snares and searching for food. Midday he rested in the cave, staying out of the increasingly intense heat. Afternoons he explored, expanding his knowledge of the terrain, finding new water sources, mapping the canyons in his mind. He spoke to no one because there was no one to speak to. He saw no humans because he'd chosen his location carefully, far from any established trails or settlements. The only voices he heard were his own thoughts, and increasingly he stopped even those. Silence became his natural state. At first, the quiet had been oppressive, almost painful. His mind would race, replaying the last day with Sarah and Emma over and over, torturing himself with details: the sound of Emma's laugh, the way Sarah hummed while cooking, the weight of his daughter in his arms. But gradually, the memories began to fade. Not disappear, they would never disappear, but lose their sharp edges. The constant mental noise of grief and rage began to quiet, replaced by a different kind of awareness. He became attuned to the sounds of the desert, the rustle of wind through sage, the cry of a hawk overhead, the skitter of a lizard across stone. He began to feel less like Mason Evans, husband and father, prospector and dreamer, and more like simply a presence in the landscape, a creature among creatures. In April, he saw his first human in 4 months. Mason was hunting near a series of low hills about 3 miles from his canyon when he spotted the wagon. It was a single covered wagon, struggling through the sandy terrain, clearly off the main immigrant trails. 2 men walked beside it, encouraging the exhausted oxen. A woman sat in the driver's seat, and Mason could see at least 2 children peering out from the back. He froze, instinctively dropping behind a large boulder. His heart hammered in his chest, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming anxiety. People, voices, connection. He could walk down there right now, call out to them. They'd probably welcome him, share food, offer companionship. He could ask where they were headed, maybe travel with them for a while, return to civilization, start over somewhere new. The thought made him physically ill. Mason pressed his back against the hot stone and waited, hardly breathing, until the wagon passed out of sight. Even after it was gone, he stayed hidden for another hour, making absolutely sure they wouldn't circle back or make camp nearby. When he finally emerged, his hands were shaking. The encounter had triggered something in him, a deep, visceral rejection of human contact that surprised him with its intensity. He'd thought this was about grief, about needing time alone to process his loss. But in that moment, hiding from that innocent family like a wild animal, he realized it was something more. He had fundamentally changed. The thought of speaking to another person, of explaining himself, of engaging in the social rituals and expectations of human interaction, it all felt impossible, foreign, like being asked to speak a language he'd forgotten. Mason returned to his canyon and didn't leave it for 3 days. He sat in his cave, trying to understand what was happening to him. Was he going mad? Maybe, probably. But if this was madness, it felt more comfortable than sanity had ever been. By summer, the Mojave became an oven. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees F, sometimes reaching 120. The landscape shimmered with heat mirages. Most creatures became nocturnal, hiding from the brutal sun. Mason adapted. He slept during the worst heat of the day, deep in his cave, where the temperature stayed relatively cool. He moved in the early morning and late evening, doing what hunting and gathering he needed to do when the sun was low. He learned to cover his head and exposed skin with cloth torn from his deteriorating shirt. He learned to move slowly, to never waste energy, to drink water in small sips rather than gulps. The heat drove him deeper into himself. Days would pass where he didn't form a single coherent thought, existing in a state that was almost meditative. He watched lizards hunt insects. He observed the way shadows moved across canyon walls. He felt the wind change direction as evening approached. He was becoming part of the desert's rhythm, its breath. In August, a prospector came into his canyon. Mason was in his cave when he heard the sound. Boots on stone, the clink of metal, labored breathing. He peered over his wall and saw a man stumbling along the canyon floor, clearly lost and in bad shape. The prospector was older, maybe 50, burned dark by the sun and swaying with what was probably heat exhaustion and dehydration. "Hello," the man called out, his voice cracked and desperate. "Anyone, please, I need water." Mason watched him from above. The man was maybe 40 feet away, directly below his position. Mason had water. He had food. He could save this man's life with a simple word, a gesture of help. He remained absolutely silent. The prospector stumbled forward, following the canyon as it curved out of sight. His calls for help faded. Mason stayed in his cave motionless, listening until there was nothing but wind. He told himself the man would be fine. The canyon led eventually to an area where water sometimes pooled. Or the man might find his way back to wherever he'd come from. People were resourceful. He'd probably be fine. But Mason knew he was lying to himself. The man had looked bad, really bad. There was a good chance he'd die out there. For 3 days, Mason wrestled with guilt. He'd let a man die when he could have helped. What did that make him? What was he becoming? But on the 4th day, when he ventured out and found the prospector's body near the canyon mouth, the man had made it less than half a mile before collapsing. Mason felt something unexpected. Nothing. He looked at the body, already being consumed by scavengers, and felt no guilt, no horror, no connection. Just the same detachment he'd feel observing a dead rabbit or a dried cactus. The man was dead. That was a fact, like heat, like stone, like sky. Mason turned away and returned to his cave. He didn't think about the prospector again. By the time winter returned, Mason had been in the desert for nearly a year. He'd lost at least 40 pounds. His hair and beard had grown wild. His clothes were mostly rags now, held together with rope and strips of canvas. His skin was dark and leathery from constant sun exposure, but he'd survived more than survived. He'd found a strange kind of peace in the absolute isolation. He spent the second winter much as he'd spent the first months, hunting small game, collecting water, enduring the cold nights. But now it felt routine rather than desperate. He knew what he was doing. He'd learned the desert's patterns, its moods, its gifts and cruelties. Occasionally, he thought about Sarah and Emma, but the memories were distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. The grief that had driven him into the desert had transformed into something else, a kind of permanent emptiness that he no longer tried to fill. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, and that was exactly as he wanted it. In March 1849, exactly 2 years after leaving his homestead, Mason made a decision. He needed better shelter. The cave had served him well, but it was too exposed, too close to areas where he'd seen occasional travelers. If he was going to do this, truly commit to a life of absolute isolation, he needed to go deeper, farther from humanity, farther from everything. He packed his few possessions and left the canyon, heading southeast into the most remote section of the Mojave he'd yet encountered. For days, he walked through a landscape so barren it seemed alien. Vast expanses of cracked clay, fields of black volcanic rock, mountains that looked like they'd been carved by a hostile god. And then he found it, an abandoned mineshaft. It was old, probably from some long, forgotten silver or copper claim, and it had partially collapsed, making it invisible unless you were right on top of it. The entrance was a narrow crack in a hillside, easily missed. Inside, the shaft opened into a larger chamber, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with a high ceiling. The air was cool and dry. Water seeped through one wall, creating a small pool. Not much, but constant. It was perfect. Mason began the work of making it home. He reinforced the entrance, building it up so it looked even more like natural rockfall. He created ventilation by carefully opening a crack in the ceiling. He built a fire pit with stones arranged so smoke would disperse through multiple small openings, rather than a single obvious plume. He furnished his underground home with stones for sitting, flat rocks for surfaces, depressions for storage. He wove baskets from desert plants to hold food and tools. He created a bed from piled sand covered with his canvas tarp and what remained of his clothes. It took months, but when he was done, Mason had created something that was more than a survival shelter. It was a hermitage, a place designed for one person to live indefinitely, completely cut off from the world above. The years began to blur. Time lost meaning when there were no events to mark, no seasons beyond hot and less hot, no people to age alongside. Mason's beard grew to his chest, his hair became a matted tangle, his body became lean and wiry, perfectly adapted to the harsh environment. He developed routines that never varied. Wake before dawn, check snares, hunt if needed, return to the mine before the heat became unbearable, rest, venture out again in the evening, return, sleep. Repeat. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, all identical, all empty of everything except survival. He stopped thinking in words, stopped having conversations with himself. His mind became almost animal, focused entirely on immediate needs and observations. Where is water? What can I eat? Is it safe? He saw humans occasionally, prospectors, travelers, once a small military expedition mapping the area. He always hid, waiting for them to pass, feeling nothing but a desire for them to leave. They were intrusions, disruptions in the perfect isolation he'd created. By 1860, Mason had been alone for 13 years. He'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like. He'd forgotten most of the details of his previous life. Names and faces had faded into abstraction. Even Sarah and Emma were more like distant dreams than actual memories. He was no longer Mason Evans in any meaningful sense. He was just the hermit of the Mojave, a figure that existed in the cracks between civilization and wilderness, belonging to neither. And he would remain there alone and silent for another 29 years. Mojave Desert 1008, 160 1008, 175. The silence had a sound. Mason discovered this in his 14th year alone. It wasn't truly quiet in the desert. There was always wind, the scratch of insects, the distant cry of birds. But beneath all that, when he sat perfectly still in his mineshaft, there was something else. A low hum that seemed to come from inside his own head, or perhaps from the earth itself. He couldn't tell which. He spent hours listening to it, trying to understand its rhythm. By 1860, Mason's connection to his former humanity had worn so thin it was nearly transparent. He moved through his days like a ghost, performing the necessary tasks of survival with mechanical efficiency. Hunt, eat, sleep, survive. The cycle repeated endlessly, without purpose beyond its own continuation. His body had become something he barely recognized, lean to the point of being skeletal, every muscle defined by the constant work of desert survival. His skin was so dark and weathered it looked like old leather. His hair and beard, now gray and tangled, hung past his shoulders. His fingernails had thickened and yellowed. His teeth, surprisingly, remained mostly intact. The sparse diet and lack of sugar had preserved them better than civilization might have. He looked less like a man and more like something the desert had created from sand and stone and desperation. The mineshaft had become an extension of himself. Every surface was familiar, every shadow known. He'd arranged his space with an obsessive precision that grew more elaborate each year. Stones sorted by size and color, tools hung in exact positions, food stores organized by type and age. The orderliness was the only structure left in his mind, and he clung to it desperately. In the spring of 1862, something changed. Mason was checking his snare lines when he found the rattlesnake. It was coiled near a trap, possibly attracted by the scent of a rabbit that had been caught there the day before. The snake was massive, easily 5 feet long, as thick as his forearm, with a pattern of diamonds along its back that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Most men would have killed it or given it wide berth. Mason sat down and watched it. The snake watched him back, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. Its rattle buzzed a warning, a dry, urgent sound. But when Mason didn't move, didn't threaten, the snake gradually relaxed. Its coils loosened slightly, the rattle went silent. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, man and snake separated by 3 feet of sand, studying each other. Finally, the snake uncoiled and slithered away, disappearing into a crack in the rocks. Mason sat there long after it was gone, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, connection. Not to a person, but to another living thing, another survivor in this hostile place. He began seeking out such encounters. He'd sit near lizards basking on rocks, moving so slowly they'd eventually ignore him. He'd watch hawks circle overhead, trying to see the world from their perspective. He'd observe scorpions hunting at night, their bodies glowing faintly under the starlight. The animals became more real to him than any human had ever been. They didn't lie, didn't betray, didn't destroy. They simply existed, following their nature, surviving as best they could. He was one of them now. It was during this period that Mason began the journals. He didn't have proper paper. That had been gone for years. Instead, he used what the desert provided. Animal hides scraped thin and dried smooth, pieces of bark from the few trees near distant water sources, even flat stones that he scratched with pieces of charcoal and harder rock. At first, the writing was practical. Records of where he'd found water, notes on animal movements and seasonal patterns, simple marks and symbols, since he was forgetting how to form proper letters. But gradually the journals became something else, something darker. The entries grew more abstract, more fragmented. He wrote about the sound of silence, about the way time felt different when you stopped counting days, about the faces he saw sometimes in the rock formations. Not imagination, he insisted, but real faces that appeared when the light hit just right. He wrote about Sarah and Emma, but no longer as people he'd known. They became characters in a story he'd once heard, distant and unreal. He described them as the woman and the child, and speculated about what had happened to them, as if he hadn't been there, hadn't held their bodies, hadn't buried them with his own hands. The disconnect was complete. One entry, scratched onto a piece of hide in crude, barely legible marks, read, "Saw the wolf today, bigger than before. It watches from the ridge. I think it knows what I am. Maybe it remembers too. Maybe we're the same. There was no wolf. There hadn't been wolves in that part of the Mojave for decades." In 1867, Mason encountered another human for the first time in years. A surveying team came through the area, mapping the desert for the railroad companies that were beginning to eye expansion routes. There were 5 men, well equipped with pack mules and proper supplies. They set up camp less than 2 miles from Mason's mineshaft. He watched them from a distance, hidden behind rocks, observing their movements with the same detachment he'd observe ants. They laughed, talked, shared food around a fire. The sounds of their voices carried across the empty landscape, jarring and alien. Mason's hands trembled as he watched, not from fear or loneliness or desire to approach, but from revulsion. The sounds they made, words, laughter, the casual noise of human interaction, physically disturbed him. It was like listening to something fundamentally wrong, a violation of the desert's natural order. One of the surveyors wandered away from camp to relieve himself. He came within 50 feet of where Mason was hiding, close enough that Mason could hear the man humming to himself, some tune from a world Mason no longer belonged to. The urge to attack was overwhelming and unexpected, not from malice but from a territorial instinct that was purely animal. This was his space. These intruders needed to leave. Mason's hand went to the knife at his belt. For several long seconds he genuinely considered killing the man, simply cutting his throat and dragging the body away, the way a cougar might kill an intruder in its territory. The thought shocked him back to something like awareness. He released the knife and remained frozen until the man finished and walked back to camp. That night, Mason retreated deep into his mineshaft and didn't emerge until the surveyors had moved on 3 days later. But the incident left him shaken. What was he becoming? The question haunted him, but he couldn't find an answer that made sense. He was Mason Evans. No, he wasn't. That person was dead. He was a hermit, a desert creature, a ghost, a nothing. He stopped trying to define himself and simply existed. The 1870s brought changes to the broader world that barely touched Mason's isolated existence. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Nevada became a state. Wars were fought and presidents elected. None of it mattered in the Mojave, but Mason changed nonetheless. His journals from this period, later discovered and analyzed, showed signs of severe psychological deterioration. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, the content more disturbing. He wrote about conversations he'd had, but there was no one to talk to. He described visitors who came to the mineshaft, a prospector named William, a Paiute elder, a woman who reminded him of someone he'd once known. These people would sit with him for hours, he wrote, sharing stories and advice. None of them existed. He wrote about the compact, an agreement he'd made with the desert itself. In exchange for his complete isolation, for removing himself entirely from humanity, the desert would sustain him, protect him, keep him alive as long as he honored the terms. No contact with humans, no return to civilization, no breaking of the silence. He believed this absolutely. He wrote about the demons that lived in the rocks. The civilization demons, he called them. They whispered to him sometimes, trying to lure him back to towns and people. They spoke with familiar voices, promised comfort and company. But he knew they were lying. If he listened to them, if he broke his compact, the desert would destroy him. In one particularly disturbing entry, scratched onto a flat stone in letters that grew larger and more chaotic toward the end, he wrote, "Today I remembered my name, Mason Evans, Mason Evans, Mason Evans." I repeated it until the sounds meant nothing, just noise, like the wind, like the rattle of stones. I am not that name anymore. I am not any name. I am the space between footsteps. I am the silence after the wind stops. I am what remains when everything else is stripped away. By 1875, 28 years into his isolation, Mason had become something that defied easy categorization. Not quite sane, not quite mad, not dead, but not alive in any way that mattered. He existed in a liminal space between states, suspended in the vast emptiness he'd chosen. His routine had become ritualistic. He would wake exactly at dawn. His body had become so attuned to the sun that he needed no other clock. He would spend exactly 1 hour sitting at the entrance of his mineshaft, watching the light change as the sun rose. Then he would check his traps, taking the same path every day, stepping in the same footprints worn into the stone and sand. He would return before the heat of midday, eat whatever he'd caught or gathered, and spend the hottest hours sitting in the deepest part of the mineshaft in absolute darkness, listening to the sound of silence. Evening was for maintenance, repairing tools, working hides, organizing his space. Night was for watching stars. Though he no longer knew their names or patterns, they were just lights in the darkness, as meaningless and infinite as everything else. He spoke to himself sometimes, but not in words, just sounds, grunts, hums, clicking noises made with his tongue. A private language that meant nothing and everything. The few travelers who passed through the area over the years sometimes reported strange things. Offerings left on rocks, small arrangements of stones, bones arranged in patterns, crude symbols scratched into cliff faces. They attributed it to local native tribes, but it was Mason leaving marks that even he didn't understand, driven by compulsions that had replaced rational thought. One journal entry from this time, written on a piece of hide in what appeared to be a mixture of charcoal and his own blood, simply repeated the same phrase over and over. "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." It filled the entire surface, the words overlapping until they became an abstract tangle of marks. Was it a declaration of survival, a cry for help, a symptom of a mind that had finally broken? Perhaps all three. Perhaps none. In the spring of 1876, something happened that shook Mason from his ritualistic existence. He found human remains. A prospector had died in the hills near his territory, probably from heat and dehydration. The body had been there for weeks, picked over by scavengers, scattered by wind. Bones gleamed white in the sun. Scraps of clothing flapped in the breeze. A broken canteen lay nearby, empty. Mason stood over the remains for hours, studying them with intense fascination. This was what humans became, bones and dust. No different from the rabbit skulls he'd collected, the snake skeletons he'd found. Just another dead thing in a landscape of dead things. He picked up the skull, turning it over in his hands. It was weathered and cracked, bleached by the sun. He tried to imagine this as a person, someone with thoughts and feelings and memories, but he couldn't. It was just an object, an interesting shape. He took the skull back to his mineshaft. Over the following months, he would sit with it for hours, having one sided conversations with the empty eye sockets. Not because he thought it was alive or could hear him, he wasn't that far gone yet, but because it was a proxy for humanity itself, and he found he had things he wanted to say. "You're better this way," he told the skull one evening, his voice rasping and strange from disuse. "All of you better as bones, quiet, harmless, this is all you ever were anyway. Just bones pretending to be something more." He laughed at his own words, and the sound of his laughter, harsh and broken, scared him so badly he didn't speak again for months. Mojave Desert, 1876, 1887. The prospector named Jacob Hartley had heard the stories in the saloons of Barstow. Every mining town had its legends: ghost mines, lost treasures, mysterious hermits. Most were nonsense invented by drunk men with too much time and too little luck. But the story of the Mojave ghost interested Jacob because it was always the same. Different men, years apart, all reported the same thing: signs of human habitation in the deepest desert. Footprints that appeared and disappeared, stone arrangements that weren't natural. Once a surveyor claimed he'd seen a figure watching him from a ridge, a skeletal, wild thing that vanished like smoke when he looked directly at it. Jacob was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe that where there was smoke, there might be fire. And if someone had managed to survive out in that wasteland for any length of time, they might have found something worth finding. A water source, a hidden mine, something valuable. In June 1876, he went looking. Jacob was equipped better than most prospectors who wandered into the Mojave. He had 2 pack mules loaded with water and supplies, proper desert clothing, and most importantly, a good sense of direction. He'd been exploring the Southwest for 15 years and knew how to read the land, how to find the small signs that revealed water and shelter. He spent 3 weeks moving through the most remote sections of the desert, following the vague reports he'd collected. He found nothing at first, just the usual desolation, the endless variations of sand and stone and heat. Then, in a narrow canyon that didn't appear on any map he'd seen, he found the first real evidence: a snare trap. It was crude but effective, positioned along a game trail. The construction showed knowledge and skill. This wasn't some lost traveler making desperate attempts at survival. This was someone who knew what they were doing, who'd been doing it for a long time. Jacob's excitement grew. He followed the canyon, looking for more signs. He found them: stone arrangements that marked water sources, barely visible paths worn into the rock, places where someone had clearly sheltered and made small fires. Someone lived out here, really lived, not just survived temporarily. It took him 2 more days of careful searching before he found the mineshaft. He almost missed it. The entrance was so well disguised it looked like natural rockfall. But Jacob had spent enough time around old mines to recognize the signs. The way the stones had settled wasn't quite natural. There was a pattern to it, however subtle. He approached carefully, his hand on the pistol at his belt. "Hello, anyone there?" No response, just the wind moving through the canyon. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jacob called. "Just a prospector, same as you might be. Thought maybe we could talk, share some supplies." Still nothing. Jacob waited for several minutes, then carefully climbed toward the entrance. Up close, he could see it definitely was an entrance. There was a gap between the stones, a darkness beyond. The air coming from it was cooler than the surrounding desert, carrying a faint smell of smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant. "I'm coming in," Jacob announced. "Don't shoot me if you're in there." He squeezed through the entrance, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. As shapes began to resolve, his sense of excitement transformed into unease, then into something approaching horror. The space was clearly inhabited, but not in any way that suggested sanity. The walls were covered with markings, symbols, drawings, words scratched into stone. Some were crude pictures of animals and landscapes, others were patterns that repeated obsessively. Still others were words, but many were illegible or made no sense. The compact holds, silence, 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 I am the bones, the bones, the bones. The floor was organized with disturbing precision, stones arranged by size in perfect rows, animal bones sorted by type. Skulls in one area, leg bones in another, ribs in a third. Tools hung from the walls, each in an exact position, surrounded by scratched outlines showing where they belonged. And in the center of the space, arranged in a small circle, were several human skulls. Jacob's hand went to his pistol. Jesus Christ, he whispered. A sound from the deeper darkness made him spin around. At first, he saw nothing. Then slowly, a shape emerged from the shadows at the back of the chamber, a figure so gaunt and wild it barely looked human. Mason stood hunched, his long hair and beard tangled with debris, his eyes catching the dim light like an animal's. He wore almost nothing, just rags tied around his waist, his body caked with dirt and so thin his ribs stood out starkly. In one hand he held a knife made from a sharpened piece of bone. For a long moment neither man moved. "Hey now," Jacob said carefully, raising his free hand in a placating gesture. "I don't mean any harm. I was just—" Mason's mouth opened, and a sound came out that made Jacob's blood run cold. Not words, just a hissing, clicking noise that held warning and rage and something that might have been fear. "Easy, friend, easy." Jacob took a slow step backward. "I'll just leave. I'll go right now, and you won't see me again." Mason moved forward with shocking speed, not attacking, but positioning himself between Jacob and the deeper part of the mineshaft. The message was clear: get out. Jacob didn't need to be told twice. He backed toward the entrance, keeping his eyes on the wild figure. "Okay, I'm going. He squeezed back through the entrance and scrambled down to the canyon floor, his heart hammering. He didn't stop until he'd put a half-mile between himself and that place. That night, camped in a different canyon with his mules tied close, Jacob tried to make sense of what he'd seen. The skulls especially bothered him. Were they trophies, evidence of murders? Or had the hermit simply collected them the way he'd apparently collected everything else? And how long had that man been out there? He looked ancient, weathered beyond any normal aging. Years, certainly. Maybe decades. Jacob made a decision. He'd go back to Barstow, report what he'd found to the authorities. This was beyond his ability to handle. That hermit needed help, whether he knew it or not. And if those skulls meant what they might mean, this was a matter for the law. But when Jacob reached Barstow 3 days later and told his story to the local sheriff, a tired man named Coleman, the reception was less than he'd hoped. "Hermit in the deep desert," Coleman said, not looking up from the paperwork on his desk. "Yeah, we've heard the stories. Got a report maybe 5 years back about something similar. Sent a deputy to look into it. He spent a week out there, found nothing. Figured it was just desert tales." "This isn't a tale," Jacob insisted. "I saw him, saw where he lives. There are skulls, Sheriff, human skulls." That got Coleman's attention. Human. Looked human to me. Coleman sighed and leaned back in his chair. Could be Indian burial sites. Could be old prospectors who died out there, and this hermit collected their remains. Could be a lot of things. The desert's full of bones, Hartley. Doesn't mean there's been any crime. The man looked like he'd been out there for years. Decades maybe. He's not right in the head. He needs help. And what do you expect me to do about it? Ride out into the middle of nowhere? Drag a man back to town who hasn't asked for help? On what grounds? Being strange isn't a crime. Living in the desert isn't a crime. He threatened me with a knife. Did he attack you? Well, no. Then he defended his home from an intruder, which is his right. Coleman shuffled his papers, signaling the conversation was over. Look, Hartley, I appreciate you coming in. If you want to file a formal report, I'll write it up. But unless someone can show me evidence of an actual crime, I'm not organizing an expedition into the Mojave to bother some hermit who wants to be left alone. Jacob left the sheriff's office, frustrated but not entirely surprised. Law enforcement in these territories was stretched thin, focused on actual crimes, robberies, murders, claim disputes. A hermit living peacefully, if strangely, wasn't a priority, but Jacob couldn't let it go. Over the following months, he told his story in saloons and mining camps. It spread, growing with each retelling, becoming part of the local mythology. The Mojave ghost had been seen. He lived in a mineshaft decorated with human bones. He was either a murderer or a madman or both. He'd been out there for 30 years or more, living like an animal. The story reached the ears of a journalist named Samuel Pierce, who worked for a San Francisco newspaper. Samuel saw a story with potential, mysterious hermit, possible crimes, the romance of desert. In the spring of 1878, he organized a small expedition to find Mason's lair. Samuel Pierce was nothing if not thorough. He hired Jacob Hartley as a guide, brought along a photographer with a portable camera, and arranged for a U.S. Marshal named Davis to accompany them, partly for protection, partly to give the expedition official weight. They reached the mineshaft in early April. During the brief period when the desert was almost pleasant, the entrance was exactly as Jacob had described it. Samuel felt a thrill of professional excitement. This could be a major story. Mr. Evans, Samuel called toward the entrance, using the name that had somehow attached itself to the hermit in the retellings. No one knew if it was actually his name. It had simply emerged from accumulated stories. "My name is Samuel Pierce. I'm a journalist. I'd like to talk to you, sir. Perhaps tell your story to the world." No response. They waited for an hour, calling periodically. Finally, Marshal Davis made the decision to enter. "Stay behind me," he ordered, drawing his pistol. The interior was as disturbing as Jacob had reported. The symbols on the walls, the organized bones, the obsessive arrangement of objects. The photographer immediately began setting up his equipment, fascinated despite his obvious unease, but the hermit was gone. They searched the mineshaft thoroughly. It was clear someone had been living there recently. There were food stores, water in a container, tools in good repair, but the occupant had fled, probably when he heard them approaching. "Damn," Samuel muttered. He'd hoped for an interview, maybe even a photograph. The hermit's fate would have sold newspapers across the country. "Look at this," the photographer called from the back of the chamber. He was examining something on the wall. They gathered around. On a relatively smooth section of stone, someone had carved words with painstaking effort. The letters were crude but legible. "Mason Evans, December 1847. I am still here." Below that, in different letters, newer, shakier, "The silence is everything. People are the disease. I am cured." Samuel copied the words carefully into his notebook. This was good material, disturbing but good. They spent several hours documenting everything. The photographer took pictures of symbols, the arranged bones, the human skulls. Marshal Davis examined the skulls carefully and determined they were old, probably remains from long dead prospectors or travelers that the hermit had collected. No evidence of murder, Davis concluded, just a very disturbed man living in isolation. As they prepared to leave, Samuel noticed one more thing, a collection of hide pieces covered in writing. The journals, he gathered them carefully. There were dozens, spanning what must have been years. "This is it," he said, excitement growing, his story. In his own words, "They left supplies at the entrance, food, water, fresh clothes, with a note explaining they meant no harm and offering help if the hermit wanted it. Then they departed, heading back towards civilization with their evidence and documentation." The article Samuel Pierce published 3 months later caused a sensation. "The Madman of the Mojave, 30 Years of Isolation," ran in the San Francisco Chronicle and was quickly picked up by papers across the country. The photographs were haunting. The empty mineshaft with its strange decorations, the arranged bones, the words carved into stone, but it was the excerpts from the journals that truly captured public imagination. Samuel had selected the most coherent and disturbing passages, presenting them with just enough context to make them comprehensible but mysterious. The public response was immediate and divided. Some saw Mason as a tragic figure driven mad by grief. Others saw him as a dangerous lunatic who should be captured and institutionalized. Religious groups debated whether his isolation was a form of spiritual seeking or evidence of demonic influence. Philosophers wrote essays about the nature of sanity and the human need for society. Everyone had an opinion about the Mojave hermit. Several more expeditions tried to find him over the following years. A few succeeded in locating the mineshaft, but Mason was never there. He'd abandoned it after the first intrusion, moving deeper into the desert to a location known only to him. Sightings continued, always from a distance, always uncertain. A figure on a ridge, footprints in sand, signs of human presence in places no human should be able to survive. By the mid-1880s, the story had become legend. Dime novels were written about Mad Mason, the ghost of the Mojave. Most bore little resemblance to reality, adding elements of violence and drama that sold copies but had no basis in fact. In some versions, he was a murderer. In others, a prospector guarding a secret mine. In the most lurid, he'd become something inhuman, a demon or ghost or creature cursed to wander the desert forever. The real Mason Evans, meanwhile, continued his existence somewhere in the vast emptiness, aware now that the world knew about him but unable or unwilling to change course. The compact held, the silence continued, he endured. He was by then in his 70s, an age few men reached even with access to medicine and comfort. That he'd survived so long in such conditions was itself remarkable, a testament to either incredible resilience or sheer stubbornness, but even the strongest eventually fail. Even the desert's most adapted creatures eventually succumb. Mojave Desert, summer 1889. Mason knew he was dying. He'd known for months, really. But he'd pushed the knowledge away the same way he'd pushed away every uncomfortable thought for 42 years. But now, in the brutal heat of July 1889, it could no longer be ignored. His body was failing in ways that couldn't be fixed with rest or food. His hands trembled constantly. His vision blurred at the edges. His chest hurt with each breath. A sharp pain that suggested something fundamental had broken inside. He was 74 years old, though he'd long since stopped counting. He'd survived longer than any man should have been able to in these conditions. Perhaps that was enough. He'd been living in a new shelter for the past decade. Not a mineshaft this time, but a series of interconnected caves in a remote box canyon that was nearly impossible to access. Entrance required climbing a nearly vertical rock face, then squeezing through a crack barely wide enough for a man. On the other side was a hidden canyon, cut off from the world, with caves that stayed cool even in the worst heat. It was the most perfect isolation he'd found. No one could reach him here. No one even knew this place existed. He would die here, he realized, die alone exactly as he'd lived. The thought brought neither fear nor comfort. It simply was. On a morning in late July, Mason woke to find he couldn't stand. His legs simply wouldn't support his weight. He sat against the cave wall, breathing carefully, trying to assess the situation with the detached, practical sense that had kept him alive so long. This was it then, the final failure. He had water within reach. A small pool collected rainwater from a crack in the cave ceiling. He had some dried meat, though he wasn't sure he could eat it. He had his journals, his tools, his carefully organized possessions. He had everything he needed, and none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in decades, Mason Evans thought clearly about his life, not with the fragmented, damaged thinking that had characterized his isolation years, but with a strange clarity that perhaps came with approaching death. What had it all been for? He'd come into the desert to escape humanity, to remove himself from a species that had destroyed everything he loved. He'd succeeded completely. 42 years without meaningful human contact. 42 years of absolute isolation. And what had it accomplished? Sarah and Emma were still dead. The men who killed them had gotten away, probably lived full lives, died in their beds, never faced justice. His grief had transformed into something else over the years, something so warped and internalized it barely resembled the original emotion. He'd become exactly what he'd sought to become, nothing, an absence of connection, of meaning, of purpose. He erased Mason Evans so completely that nothing remained but the animal functions of survival. Was that victory or defeat? He couldn't decide. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was neither. Over the next 3 days, Mason drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain in his chest grew worse, making each breath an effort. He drank water when he could reach it, didn't bother with food. In his more lucid moments, he thought about the life he'd left behind. Not just Sarah and Emma, though they appeared in his thoughts too, but the whole world of people and connection and meaning that he abandoned. He thought about the surveyors he'd hidden from, the prospector he'd let die, the journalist and marshal who documented his existence. All those encounters where he'd chosen isolation over even the smallest human kindness. Had he been right to do so, or had he simply been afraid? The question had no answer, or too many answers, and his mind was too tired to sort through them. On what he somehow knew was his last day, Mason dragged himself to the cave entrance. The effort took hours and left him gasping, but he needed to see the sky one more time, to feel the sun, to be in the desert. He'd made his home and his prison. He sat propped against the cave wall, looking out at the vast expanse of sand and stone and sky. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of orange and red. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals. The wind carried the scent of creosote and hot stone. It was beautiful in its way, harsh and unforgiving, but honest. The desert had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. It had never lied to him, never betrayed him. It had simply existed and allowed him to exist within it. "Thank you," Mason whispered. His voice was a ruined rasp he barely recognized. The words felt strange in his mouth, absurd even, but they also felt true. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Mason's thoughts grew less coherent, fragmenting into images and sensations. Sarah's smile, Emma's laugh, the smell of coffee in the morning, the feel of clean sheets, the sound of rain on a roof. All the things he'd given up, all the human comforts and connections he'd rejected, had they been worth keeping, he still didn't know. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red into the darkening sky. Stars began to appear, the same stars he'd watched for 42 years, never learning their names again, simply accepting their presence. Mason's breathing grew shallow. The pain in his chest spread, becoming almost abstract. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the desert fading at the edges. In his last moment of consciousness, he thought he saw figures approaching across the sand, Sarah and Emma, walking hand in hand toward him. But he knew they were hallucinations, products of an oxygen-starved brain shutting down. He closed his eyes when he opened them again, or thought he did. He was standing in his old cabin near Virginia City. It was before the fire, before the deaths. Sarah was cooking something that smelled wonderful. Emma was playing with a rag doll on the floor. "Mason," Sarah said, turning to smile at him. "Where have you been? You've been gone so long." "I know," he said, and his voice was young again. "Whole, I'm sorry. I got lost." "Well, you're home now," she said, and held out her hand. He reached for it. Mason Evans died at sunset on July 29th, 1889, 2 years and 7 months after he'd walked into Mojave Desert. He was alone, as he'd been for most of his adult life. No one witnessed his death. No one held his hand or spoke comforting words. The desert wind blew across his body, carrying away the last traces of heat. The hawk circled once more, then flew away. Night fell, and with it the temperature dropped. Mason's body remained in the cave entrance for exactly 3 years before it was discovered, autumn 1892. The surveying expedition that found him was mapping potential routes for a new railroad spur. They'd entered the hidden canyon purely by chance. One of the pack horses had bolted, and in chasing it, they'd stumbled on the narrow passage that led to Mason's final sanctuary. The expedition leader, a man named Robert Chen, was the first to see the body, or rather, skeleton. 3 years of desert climate had reduced Mason to bones and a few scraps of leather, like skin, barely distinguishable from the dried hides he'd written his journals on. "Jesus," Robert breathed, stopping the others from entering. "There's someone here." Or was? They approached carefully, respectfully. The body was clearly very old, undisturbed except by time. Around it were the familiar signs: arranged bones, sorted stones, tools in precise positions, and journals, dozens of journals preserved by the dry air. "It's him," one of the surveyors said softly, "the Mojave Hermit." As to be, they spent hours documenting everything, treating the scene with the reverence usually reserved for archaeological sites. In a way, that's what it was, the final resting place of a man who'd become a legend, proof that the stories were true. Robert gathered the journals carefully. After the publicity from Samuel Pierce's article years before, he knew these would be valuable. Historically, if not monetarily, they were the complete record of Mason's 42 years alone, assuming anyone could decipher them. They buried Mason's remains there in the canyon, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. It seemed appropriate. He'd wanted isolation in life. Let him have it in death. Moving him to a town cemetery felt like a violation. on a flat stone at the base of the cairn. Robert used a chisel to carve a simple inscription, Mason Evans 1815-1889. He chose silence. The journals eventually made their way to academic institutions, where linguists and psychologists spent years analyzing them. They revealed in stark detail the progression of Mason's mental deterioration over decades. Early entries were relatively coherent if troubled. Later entries descended into fragmentation and delusion, but they also revealed moments of insight, passages that suggested Mason understood at least partially what was happening to him. One entry dated approximately 1881 based on contextual clues read, "I think I went mad years ago. Or maybe I was always mad, and the desert just let me be what I truly was. Does it matter? The silence is real. The solitude is real. Everything else, sanity, madness, human, animal, these are just words. And words mean nothing when there's no one to speak them to." Psychologists debated whether Mason's isolation was a prolonged suicide, a coping mechanism that went too far, or a genuine philosophical choice. Religious scholars argued about the spiritual implications. Anthropologists compared him to hermits and ascetics from other cultures. Everyone agreed on one thing: Mason Evans represented something fundamental about the human condition, our need for connection and our equally powerful need for escape. The story of the Mojave Hermit persisted into the 20th century and beyond. Books were written, documentaries made. The cave where he died became a pilgrimage site for some, though its remote location kept visitors to a minimum. The question everyone asked, was Mason Evans a tragic figure destroyed by grief, or a cautionary tale about isolation's dangers? Was he a man who found exactly what he sought, or someone who lost everything, including himself? Perhaps the answer depended on who was asking. Perhaps there was no single answer. What remained indisputable was the central fact: Mason Evans had lived 42 years in complete isolation in one of Earth's harshest environments. He'd survived longer than seemed possible through extreme temperatures, scarce resources, and the corrosive effects of absolute solitude. And in the end, he died exactly as he'd chosen to live, alone in silence, removed from the human world that had once destroyed everything he loved. Whether that represented victory or tragedy, peace or despair, remained a question that could never be fully answered. Mason had taken the answer with him into the desert silence, where it would remain forever. In 1923, a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison visited the site where Mason had died. She was writing a psychological study on extreme isolation and wanted to see the place firsthand. After the difficult journey into the hidden canyon, she sat near the cairn marking his grave and wrote in her own journal, "I tried to imagine what it was like 42 years without a conversation, without a touch, without any of the connections we consider essential to being human. The silence here is profound, almost physical. Even with my companions waiting below, even knowing I can leave anytime, it feels oppressive." But perhaps Mason didn't experience it as oppression. Perhaps after everything he'd lost, the silence felt like relief. Perhaps removing himself from humanity was the only way he could survive having humanity taken from him. I don't think we can judge him, those of us who haven't lost what he lost. We can only observe, document, and perhaps learn something about the extremes of human endurance and the price it exacts. Mason Evans was many things: hermit, madman, survivor, victim, but more than anything, he was human, even in his rejection of humanity. And perhaps that's the real lesson. You can flee from people, from connection, from the world, but you can't flee from yourself. Mason carried his humanity into the desert, and it was still there when he died, however warped and transformed by decades of silence. We are social creatures. Isolation damages us in fundamental ways. Mason Evans proved that, if nothing else. He survived in body for 42 years, but his mind, his soul, his essential self, those died much earlier, slowly eroded by the very isolation he'd chosen as salvation. There's profound sadness in that, and perhaps a kind of terrible beauty. Dr. Morrison left the canyon as the sun set, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. Behind her, the cairn stood silent, marking the place where a man had ended a 4 decade exile from his own species. The desert wind blew across the stones, carrying no sound but its own endless whisper. The same wind that had blown for Mason Evans day after day, year after year, in the absolute solitude he'd sought and found and been ultimately destroyed by. The silence held as it always had, as it always would. The end.